extraordinarily highly pulsed, but it is being set up with extraordinary numbers of 5G antennae in close proximity to our homes, schools, hospitals, businesses, and making it essentially impossible to avoid these exposures of these extraordinarily highly pulsed and actually very high intensity EMFs. And let me say, the industry predicts that the millimeter wave frequencies, which are to be used in 5G, can only produce effects in the outer 1 millimeter of the body. So, basically in your skin. We know, in fact, that's false. And the way we know it's false is because of studies that have been done on millimeter waves that were done back 30 years ago or more, where it was shown that you get penetrating effects in humans and in animals that are vastly more penetrating than what the industry claims is possible. You get, for example, impacts on the human brain. Now, in order to have impacts on the human brain, it has to go through the hair, the skin, the skull, and the meninges that surround the brain. So it has to go in much, much deeper than 1 millimeter. And yet you do get effects. You get effects on the EEG in human brains, and you get behavioral effects on human brains. And that was shown back 30, 40 years ago. Non-pulsed millimeter waves. No, we're not talking about these extraordinarily highly pulsed 5G. So, now it is the case that 5G produces severe effects in the outer part of the body. That is true. But it's also true we can get very strong effects much deeper. Not as strong as they are at the surface, but still very strong effects. So let me just mention one thing about this that I think is of interest. And I think actually I have it in one of my later slides. Millimeter wave frequencies have powerful effects on insects. Not surprisingly, they're small. And in the year 2000 and the year 2001, the U.S. Approved 2 patents for using millimeter waves, not highly pulsed, just regular non-pulsed millimeter waves as insecticides. They are very potent in killing insects. And so we're in, this is just one of many ecological things that we're concerned about. And of course we're concerned about bees because they're important for our food crops, but insects of course have many important roles in the whole ecology. So we're talking about crashes of whole ecosystems. And I want to say one other thing about this. EMFs work in plants very much the same way they work in the cells of our bodies. And even large trees have their leaves and their reproductive organs highly exposed. You can get absolutely massive effects on these things, from millimeter waves, and certainly from 5G. And so we're in great trouble. Okay. Now what I'm going to do now is go on to some of my worst nightmares, okay? And these are all things where we have reason to think the effects are already far along based on our other exposures. And so when you put in, so they're already far along, completely apart from 5G, completely apart from further expansion of 4G, completely apart from putting radar units in cars, completely apart from all of the other exposures that are planned for us, whether we want them or not. And so one of these I think has to do with the reproductive effects. So let me. So where are we here? There was, and particularly male reproduction seems to be particularly heavily impacted by the EMFs. We also get an impact on all the other things, but male reproduction seems to be particularly heavily impacted. And so there was a meta-analysis study from Levine et al. Published in 2017. And I've got the title of it here. And what they found was that sperm counts in every single technologically advanced country on Earth, they dropped to below 50% of normal. Every single technologically advanced country. By the way, they essentially all except one of those have reproductive levels well below replacement levels, including every single EU country. So we're looking already at big drops in population. Now you may say, well, okay, we got too many people, maybe that's good. Part of the problem is in animal study, and this is a beautiful animal study that was done by Magris and Xenos, in which they showed that levels of exposure far, far below 1/1000th of our safety guideline levels. So in other words, far less than 1/1000th of what the industry claims that won't produce any effects, produce massive effects. Okay, so what did they do? They took young pairs of mice and they put them in little cages on the ground in an antenna park. So there are a bunch of broadcasting antennas. The exposures at ground level were far, far below our safety guidelines, much less than 1/1000th of our safety guidelines. So nothing should happen. Now, mice have a gestation period of about 30 days. So they can produce one litter in 30 days and then another litter a little over 30 days later, et cetera. You can study the litters really quickly, which is what they did. And so they found they did it at a couple of exposures. So the higher level exposure they studied, which as I said was extremely low. You got one litter with lower numbers than normal. You got a second litter with lower numbers than normal. No third litter. No third litter. Reproduction crashed essentially to zero. So what does that tell you? It tells you, first of all, you're getting cumulative effects. And in fact, we know that there are a lot of things that these things produce that show cumulative effects. And so you don't see the full effect on the first litter, you don't see the full effect on the second litter, but they have effects that accumulate over time, and in this situation, you get a crash to zero very quickly. At the lower level exposure they studied, it was basically the same story, but it was fifth litter that crashed to zero. Those crashes were essentially irreversible in the sense that take the animals out of the fields and you see almost no recovery of their reproduction. So the question is, are we seeing something like this in human populations? And I want to say, here in this study they were looking at uniform exposures in each of these two locations. So you're going to get more consistency, but I think we are in fact seeing evidence of crashes now in human populations. And again, this is completely apart from 4G and 5G. So there was a study published 5 months ago in Switzerland. So this was based on measurements before 5G was introduced in Switzerland. And as you may know, there have been huge protests against 5G in Switzerland. And what was shown was that this was a study of fertility in young males in which they studied sperm count, sperm motility, and other measures of sperm quality. They measured all three of those. And based on that, they concluded that 62% of young males in Switzerland, and these were chosen from different parts of the country to study, they were studied in different parts of the country, and were infertile. So young males should be the most fertile because they're young, and yet we're seeing a stunningly high level of infertility. And and before that, there were a couple of studies, one in Finland and one in Denmark, that showed also high infertility. But the 78 or 79% were either in the low fertility range or the infertile range. Most of them were in the low fertility range. So the Finnish and Danish studies that were done a year earlier were showing severe effects, but not as severe as what we're seeing in Switzerland. So it seems like, you look at the data from Levine et al., and you look at these two, what you're seeing is an apparent, very rapid increase in infertility that we're seeing. Now, I can't tell you for certain this is caused by EMFs. What I can tell you is the following. We know that EMFs produce all these effects. We know that EMFs produce lowered sperm count, sperm motility, and sperm quality. The sperm quality in the Swiss studies was absolutely stunning. Only about 4% of the sperm were normal, in their structures. That's, these are just, now when you look at what human fertility was, human fertility studies 25, 30 years ago, most of the infertility problems were, and they were relatively modest, were caused by female infertility, not male infertility. Now, male infertility is absolutely massive, and it's obviously going up very rapidly. So I think we're looking at a crash in reproduction pretty close to zero, probably within 2 years, completely apart from 5G. Completely apart from further expansion of 4G, completely apart from putting radar units in cars, completely apart from all of the other exposures. So it's my opinion, and this is just based on this, we're going to talk about a whole bunch of other things, that we need to stop 5G, and we need to start rapidly reversing the exposures we already have. Okay, so let's go on. And anyway, it's highly probable 5G radiation will push countries over the reproductive field much more rapidly. So it could be months, maybe 2 or 3 months. We don't know. We don't know how fast it's going to go, but it will probably go very, very rapidly. So we could see, if you introduce 5G all over Europe, which of course they're pushing to do, we could see the extinction of European civilization within 2, 3, 4 months. It's quite possible. Because obviously, if we crash pretty close to zero, we're extinct. Simple as that. Okay. Now, we're going to talk about the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. And let me just say that I wrote this up before it was clear what 5G was actually doing. But I think what we're seeing is 5G, in fact, is doing this. So I wrote this up as a theoretical thing that I expected, and now we're seeing it. Okay, so what do you see? You see that EMF exposures, there are 29 reviews, produce insomnia, fatigue. So I can't sleep, I'm tired all the time, I'm depressed, headaches, lack of concentration, cognitive dysfunction, anxiety, stress, agitation, memory dysfunction, sensory dysfunction. So there are impacts on the eyes, on the ears, on the other sensory organs. And tinnitus, of course, is one of the impacts on the ear. And so all these things are going on. All these things we know are caused by EMF exposures, and these are, as I think probably all of you know, very, very widespread effects that are. So we're talking about our brain function in many, many ways. And when you look at animals, what you find is very large changes in the structure of the brain that are actually very similar to what happens in Alzheimer's disease in humans. And that may not, in fact, be coincidental, and I'll talk about that later. Now, you can make an estimate of how fast these will lead to a crash in our brain function, our collective brain function, based on two things. One is on the occupational exposure studies that were done back in the 1970s and 1980s, when you could actually study the effects of a particular exposure over time and see how fast it progresses, how the effects progress. And we didn't have all these other exposures around, so we didn't have to worry about it. You could do good studies then. You can't do them now. It's impossible. And the other thing you can do is look at the progression of the impacts on the brains in animals. Typically in rodents, things go about 15 to 30 times faster than they do in us, but you can use that as at least a rough estimate of how fast our brains may be disintegrating. And and that's probably not that much of an exaggeration to say that. I estimated about a year and a half ago that we'd have probably something like 5 to 7 years before we see a crash in our collective brain function. And when we see a crash in our collective brain function, we're just going to go into utter chaos because everything is dependent on that collective brain function. So, that's a very, very rough estimate. It could easily be off by a factor of 2 in either direction, or maybe even more than that. I know, and I want to emphasize that. We're talking about very, very rough. What we're talking about are just absolutely horrendous issues. And we're certainly not talking about, things that take a generation or more, to occur. These things are short-term, relatively short-term, rapid things. And anyway, I just want to say something here. We are seeing fairly severe effects in Switzerland following 5G, in Stuttgart following 5G, and those we have written information on. I have some information from Los Angeles, California, and the effects there apparently are even more severe than what we're seeing in Stuttgart and in Switzerland. But they haven't been published, so we have to be still skeptical about that. Yeah? What is collective brain function? Well, everything that humans do is done by our collective brain function, right? I mean, whatever we do, everything. And we, in our societies, of course, work together in very complex ways, so that almost everything that's produced that occurs in modern societies involve many, many people, the collective brain function of many people. So everything is dependent on that. And that is, that's, yeah, I don't know, is there anything, yeah. Well, let me tell you a little bit.
Can you repeat the question?
What's the question?
What is the question?
What the question is, did they go crazy? Well, the simple answer to that is yes. Do they sit at home and not do anything? What do they do? One of the things, let me just say that I've been in contact with a psychiatrist in Southern California who has seen dysfunction of the sort that she has never, ever seen in her entire career. She's never seen it. She has seen very high, both suicidal and homicidal impacts in, people who feel driven to commit suicide or to commit homicide. She's seeing that very widely there. So that may be an example. And so, but when these things happen, well, you know what happens. I mean, these things produce horrendous effects, and we're already seeing those. So I don't know whether, and let me just say, you may see heavy effects from this not just from 5G, but you know, so the 5G system is really a combination 4G, 5G system. 5G is designed to work with 4G, and the plans are all for very high antenna densification, and I already talked about that, carrying both 4G and 5G. And there have been estimates that the 5G alone will be very, very high intensities. So we're talking about very powerful things in addition to the pulsations. And the pulsations, as I said, make everything vastly worse. So we're looking at things that are absolutely unprecedented in terms of our previous experience. And let me just say, before we even introduced 4G at all, you know, there were studies that were done on people living near cell phone towers, or what's in Europe called mobile phone base stations. People typically living within 300 meters. I think Luke Lender's slide showed some data from one of those studies. Typically living within 300 meters are impacted by this radiation, including many different neurological, neuropsychiatric effects. And so, you know, and basically, we're talking about everybody being within 100 meters or less of these high-powered, highly pulsed. I mean, you know, and let me just say, we're doing this. The telecom companies are doing this without doing one single biological safety test. Without doing one single biological safety test. And I've made statements that I consider that to be insane. And I believe that that's absolutely true. So, and as I said before, the safety guidelines are a complete misnomer. We shouldn't even call them, you know, we shouldn't be talking about safety guidelines. They have nothing to do with safety. So, anyway, no raise? Yeah.
How the cures? I think it's very important to look what happened in 10 years about all our sickness, like Alzheimer, diabetes, and so on. The increasing, enormous increasing, to understand and to address what's going on in our environment.
Now, I didn't want to say anything, you know, I want to make something clear about these, both the neurological and neuropsychiatric effects and the reproductive effects. We know that EMS can cause this. We have extensive data on these things. We know, for example, that every single neurotransmitter in the nervous system is released through the action of the VGCCs and intracellular calcium. You know, so we're talking about things that have extraordinarily powerful effects on the function of the entire nervous system. Everything in the nervous system is impacted. And we know that all of those reproductive effects are produced, including including the three, lowered sperm count, lowered sperm motility, lowered sperm quality in humans are produced by EMF exposures. We know that. Now, when you see these things happening, then the question is, well, okay, do we really know that these are caused by the EMF exposures, when you see them happening in a population? You don't know that for certain, but I think what we do know for certain is we simply don't have any other hypothesis that explains these. And we know the EMFs can cause these. And we know that the EMFs are extraordinarily widely distributed because of these safety guidelines that simply don't work. So, what I think is clearly true is that we are taking risks of the sort that no rational society on earth can possibly take. That, I think, is clearly true. And when you're taking risks that are imminent existential threats to our survival, and I think there are several of them, then we're looking at, and we will be destroyed one way or another from this if we keep doing what we're doing, which is running as fast as we can in exactly the wrong direction. So, you know, we have a question. Okay, you want to come up?
Is there a way to protect ourselves?
There is, I'm trying to think of, well, okay. You know, the fundamental problem we have, of course, is particularly with the 4G, 5G system is it's extraordinarily difficult to protect yourself in the sense that the best way to protect yourself is to avoid exposures. It's always the best way, and the system is set up to make it almost impossible to avoid exposures. But there are, you know, you can use shielding, for instance, in your house, you can buy clothing that's shielded. Although I don't know that I want to walk around in shielded clothing all, you know, every time I'm outside. But that's, you know, that's something that you can do. One of the kinds of shielding that people use is graphite paint. It's a black paint that you can put on your walls and your ceilings and maybe even your floors. And it's black, but you can paint over it with another color so you're not looking at black walls and stuff. You can do that. You can put shielding over your windows. It's harder to do that, but it is possible. There are shielding materials you can use on windows. So there are ways to do that, and there may be, in fact, some nutritional approaches that may be helpful for improving the resilience of your body in response to these things. I have talked about those. I don't remember if I have any information on my slides on that, on this set of slides. If I don't, I could dig out some other slides if we have time. Yeah.
Well, I just wanted to say something more about black paint.
Yeah.
I think you should ask an expert for some help because if you would do that to the entire house, you would not be connected with the Earth's energy.
They should not have.
Yeah, and that's what you need because otherwise you will also get sick and die. And
Yeah, well, okay, so, I mean, if you're in a house, of course, you don't have to shield your floor, in which case that's not a problem. If you're living up on the 10th floor of an apartment building or something, it is a problem, but you've got this huge problem anyway. Now, it is possible to buy devices that actually generate the Schumann resonance.
yes.
And so, how well they work, I'm not sure. Yeah.
I've worked with an expert who does that for people, and he said that you really need to know what you're doing because otherwise you will turn your own apartment or house into a mini, where you get the opposite effect. So I should ask people to get an expert for that.
Let me talk about that. I know something about this. Okay. If you use things like aluminum foil, that's true. Graphite paint is not true. And the reason has to do with the properties of these EMFs. So the artificial EMFs have the property that they're highly coherent. You get release of EMFs that have a consistent frequency, a consistent phase, and a consistent polarity. And for those reasons, they have much higher electrical forces, and they therefore produce much greater biological effects. Now, when those fields hit something like a graphite paint surface, these things go bouncing off in all kinds of directions, and the coherence is lost. So you lose a huge amount of the effects just simply from that. And so it's not the case that you don't, that these things. Now, if instead of using that, if you use something like aluminum foil, where it bounces off, it's still a coherent EMF, then there are problems. And so then what happens is all the EMFs you generate in your house just go bouncing around inside the house. But that's not really what's going on with graphite paint. It's also, you can, with these clothes that you buy with little tiny metal fibers, you get the same sort of thing. They bounce off in all kinds of different directions. And they lose their coherence. And that is very important in terms of lowering the biological effects. So it is the case that the Schumann resonance is an issue, but the fact of the matter is we're being destroyed. And we need to do what we can. And yeah, there are problems if you're completely shielded away from the earth, and you're right about that. So let me say, Dimitris Panagopoulos published a paper where he said we shouldn't shield ourselves. I just don't agree with him. And I think we're looking at crises of the sort we just haven't seen. We have to do what we can. And there aren't that many things that we can. Okay, let's go. Okay, these things are getting cut off. One of my concerns is very early onset Alzheimer's dementias. We are seeing the age of onset of Alzheimer's disease dropping rapidly in human populations. And so we're seeing people age 30 coming down with Alzheimer's disease. We are also seeing what are called digital dementias, where young people who are in Wi-Fi fields or working with other digital devices, getting exposed to these EMFs are coming down with dementia-like symptoms. Now, how similar or different those are from Alzheimer's is not clear. It hasn't been studied. But I'm going to tell you why I'm very concerned about this. Now, if you look at the literature on Alzheimer's disease and what causes it, there are many reviews that discuss what's called the calcium hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease. And what the calcium hypothesis, and this has been published for 25 years now, repeatedly. What the calcium hypothesis of Alzheimer's disease argues is that right at the center of the causation mechanism is excessive intracellular calcium. And that the other things that we see, things like the high levels of the amyloid beta protein and the neurofibrillary tangles and so forth, the changes in the brain structure, that those are secondary effects. Let me just say, I'm not trying to oversimplify Alzheimer's disease. It is a complex disease. Having said that, we have very good studies in animal models of Alzheimer's disease. And we know that, and I think I mentioned to you before, the EMFs produce changes in animal brains that are really, at least superficially similar to what you see in human Alzheimer's brains. And that's been known for well over 40 years now. You do get increases in the amyloid beta protein in these animal brains, where you're looking at, and the animals develop changes which are stunningly similar to what you see in Alzheimer's patients, where they have 8 or 10 different changes that are common in Alzheimer's patients. You see almost identical changes in these animals. Now, there were 2 studies that were done, and I'm referring to them here, in a rat Alzheimer's model, where it was shown that all you have to do to convert perfectly normal rats into very early onset Alzheimer's rats is to give them a series of EMF pulses. You get essentially 100% conversion from normal to Alzheimer's. That's all you have to do. And what was striking, okay, so the first study that was done, they just gave those pulses during one day in 2-month-old rats. So 2-month-old rats are sort of the rough equivalent of late adolescents because they develop quite quickly. The rats live about 3 years, so about 36 months. So when they gave these pulses, at 2 months of age, and then they looked 18 months later. So these are 20-month-old rats, so they're still, fairly young. They're certainly not, aged, highly aged type Alzheimer's. You get essentially 100% conversion to Alzheimer's, early onset Alzheimer's in the rats. If instead of giving the pulses just once, if you give them once a day, and let me say we are exposed to many, many pulse EMFs every day, even without 5G, that what you get is you get a clear Alzheimer's effects in 4 months later. So these are 6-month-old rats in an animal that lives about 36 months. So this would be the equivalent of Alzheimer's in a 12 or 13-year-old child, roughly, just from giving EMF pulses once a day. With the high pulsation, and so some of these things were done, the pulses were given within 1 second, and then they ended up with Alzheimer's 18 months later. And 5G, of course, is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed. Now, the 5G pulses are not identical to the pulses that were being used here. They all work via VGCC activation. So they may well all produce similar effects. So, so what this argues is that it's quite possible that even 1 second exposure to 5G radiation might produce universal, very early onset Alzheimer's dementias in humans. I certainly hope that's not the case. I'm not predicting that it will be the case, but it's quite plausible that it may be the case. And so it is, again, we are taking risks of the sort that are absolutely incomprehensible. It's just incredible that we could even, even think of doing this kind of stuff. Okay. I want to talk about autism. And the main sequence I'm going to talk about is this one, but I'm also going to talk about that one. And let me just say, in the U.S., the most recent data we have on the frequency of autism is 1 birth in 36. And every autism child, as I think you know, very heavily impacts the entire family. One in 36, and that was based on children born in 2004. We've had gigantic increases in EMF exposures over the last 15 years, absolutely gigantic increases in EMF exposures, even without any 5G and all these other things. And so if EMFs are an important causal factor, and I'm going to argue that they are, we may well have, we don't have the foggiest idea of what the autism incidence could be in children born in 2019. Could easily be 1 in 20, could be 1 in 10, could be 1 in 5, maybe it could be 1 in 2. Who knows? We don't know. We have no idea. Okay, so why do I think EMFs may have something to do with autism? One of the reasons is that we know from genetic studies that mutations that produce excessive activity of the VGCCs cause autism. Okay? So we know that from mutations that you get, and there are 5 different types of mutations that have been studied of that sort, and they all cause autism. Okay. We also know that there's a big literature on excessive intracellular calcium having roles in autism. And so how can this work? There are many people, including myself, who think that the key issue in autism is the formation of synapses in the developing brain. And let me just say, autism patients have been shown to have different connectivity between different parts of the brain compared with normals. And what is it that connects one part of the brain with another? It's all the synapses that connect. Okay? So that argues that there are problems with the synaptic connections. There are other things which show that there are problems with the synaptic connections, namely that mutations that influence synaptic formation can produce what are called syndromic forms of autism. So these are forms that are not identical to the garden variety autism patient, but have certain characteristic features which are not found in the broader population, but still all are clearly part of the autism spectrum. So we think that the now in the perinatal period, the period a few months before birth and then about a year or so after birth, there's a huge activity in forming synaptic connections in the human brain. So this is a unique time in the development of the brain, and so now what directs the proper formation? So the average neuron in the brain has about 1,000 synaptic connections. So you get incredible numbers of connections, and if you don't make them right, it's going to cause you problems on brain function. And there are 5 different mechanisms which are known to be involved in regulating the formation of synapses in the developing brain. These are the 5. Each of those 5 is regulated by intracellular calcium. So if you have excessive calcium in the cells during that perinatal period, you will screw these things up, and I think that will then cause autism. We have a strong argument that this sequence can cause autism. However, chemicals also act, usually indirectly, to increase the NMDA receptor activity, and that also produces increases in intracellular calcium. And then it should impact these processes. It's my opinion that both of these have roles, but it's my opinion that the EMFs are the main driver of the epidemic. Okay, so why is that? The reason that's my opinion is because many of these chemicals that act along this pathway, there were huge increases in their synthesis during the 30 years following World War II. And that was really before the autism epidemic got started. It was just right at the end of the time. We just barely see the autism epidemic started. So I think both of these have roles. I do think chemicals have roles. I want to say that very clearly. I think these two probably act synergistically together, but I also think that the EMFs are the main driver of the epidemic. I could be wrong about that. This is not something I'm saying, okay, it's absolutely clear that this is the way it is. Nevertheless, we are taking risks of the sort that no rational society on earth can possibly take. And obviously, if you have roles of both of these, we should be decreasing both of them. And rather than running as fast as we can, increasing these hand over fist. And, okay.
Martin?
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I listen to you now.
Mm-hmm.
I have to contemplate on my question. But I think autism is what we call not a disease, a condition. That mostly is clear. We know a lot about it already, about the symptoms.
About the symptoms.
About the symptoms we know.
Yeah.
But when I think about autism,
Yeah.
I think, well, maybe maybe more people around me in
Yeah.
my personal direct in my environment.
Yeah.
Maybe we have already a more invisible form of autism. I think, wow, we are disconnected more with each other. We have a problem with connecting our feeling
Yeah.
and empathy with
Yeah.
the outer world. We are. I know some.
Well,
can that be
let me-
possible
yeah.
that is one of the EMFs that cuts in our normal
Right.
social
Yeah.
behavior?
I think, I'm not saying that autism is separate from everything else. In fact, I don't think it is.
No.
And I actually listed ADHD along with autism, and a lot of people think ADHD is basically a very, very mild form of autism.
Yeah.
And it should be considered part of the autism spectrum. And the autism spectrum, of course, has a large range of effects. And let me say, autism is about 4.5 times more common in males than in females. So we see selective effects in males, and we have, in our societies, very high levels of male dysfunction
Yeah.
that has developed, in recent years. And this is also of great concern, and it may well be that these same mechanisms have roles there as well. And that, actually, if you think about it much, that's a very chilling thing as well. And there's so many chilling things about this, it's almost impossible to imagine. Anyway, but yeah, okay.
Yeah, but can I say, ask one thing? Because it is not that you can get autism in a later age. You are talking about autism that children from 2004 off were starting that you see more children getting autism. That's what you're talking about.
What I was saying was that the
becoming-
children born in 2004
Yeah.
have very high, we've got one birth in 36.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
from
okay,
that,
so-
approximately from that date on, so that I can.
No, not from that
No?
date on. It
Or
goes
from
back,
that
it
year
goes
on?
back 35, 40 years before that date.
Okay,
Yeah.
before that, but then there
Yeah.
was an increase in 2004. You could see an
Yes,
increase.
yeah,
Okay,
that's
that I
right.
do understand. But at the same time, there is more things going on, because I read also a lot about when you talk about people getting aggressive or killing themselves or killing other people because of the products of people like Bayer and everything, so that there is also a very big increase of people taking very heavy medication for things like ADHD. And what I like of the discussion today, and also the other discussions on 5G and all what's involved with it, is that it's very intelligent, it goes to facts, and I really would, how do you say to all of you, continue with staying with this, but that also means that if there is a different cause, it's also intelligent to put this very good in the foreground. So you have the 5G, but you also have a lot of medication that's and a lot.
Okay, so let me deal with your question, okay?
All dirt. in
Okay,
it.
I understand that, and
Yeah.
I understand that there are many impacts on human health.
Different
from-
discussions and
Let me
different
answer your question.
causes. Yeah.
There are many impacts on human health from chemical exposures. I've worked on those. There are many impacts on human health from, you get effects on the brain from head trauma. There are many other factors that impact us. What I'm saying here is that we have evidence in a number of these cases that the EMFs alone have absolutely massive effects.
Okay.
And we simply cannot ignore those. And when you get a situation like for instance, the one that I talked about before, where you get 100% very early onset Alzheimer's dementias from just pulse EMF exposures, we have to pay attention to those. Now, I'm not saying that nothing else is important. I'm saying that is of extraordinary importance that we can't ignore.
Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. So, yeah.
a lot of causes. And it is fabric like that. It's fabric like that. And to make it more advanced and complicated, that we will not address it. But radiation was never the case. And that's the important point today. It was never the case.
Okay, I think what I want to do now is go through most of the rest of my slides quickly because we don't have much time. But okay. I'm very concerned about the DNA effects. I'm particularly concerned about what's happening to the human gene pool. Because if we grossly contaminate the human gene pool with many, many types of, many, many mutations, we'll be extinct for that reason as well. And I have to say, I don't know how far along we are in that process. With some of these others, I can make sort of a reasonable, at least what I call a guesstimate, if you will, as to how far along we are. And it's very clear that we're already quite far along. Here, I don't know what the situation is, but I am deeply concerned about it because, as I said before, we know that EMFs we're exposed to every day impact human sperm and produce these kinds of DNA effects, and therefore can produce very substantial mutations. And cardiac effects. And let me just say the cardiac effects we're also seeing evidence of in human populations from 5G. And so what happens in these cardiac effects? Let's talk about those. So what we get, and these have been studied both in humans and in animals, you can get from EMF exposures, you can get tachycardia, rapid heartbeat. You can, from longer exposures, get bradycardia, slow heartbeat. So this is an instantaneous thing. This is a cumulative effect over time, the bradycardia. In both cases, you can get arrhythmias. Arrhythmias are associated with sudden cardiac death. And as I think probably many of you know, we have an epidemic of sudden cardiac death in young, apparently healthy athletes dying in the middle of an athletic competition. Now, okay. And as I say, we know that EMFs can cause these things. And in fact, there were studies done. I guess I don't have this on this slide here. There were studies done with millimeter waves showing that you could get sudden cardiac death in rodents with millimeter waves. And not the highly pulsed millimeter waves in 5G, just the constant millimeter wave EMF. Now, I think the reason that the heart is sensitive to these EMFs, and these all involve changes in the electrical control of the heart, is because the heartbeat is controlled by pacemaker cells. So we're talking about the biological pacemaker, not the electronic pacemaker. They're controlled by pacemaker cells that occur in what's called the sinoatrial node of the heart. And those pacemaker cells have very high densities of these VGCCs because they're very important for the pacemaking activity. They're an essential part of the pacemaker function. And so, it is my opinion that these are highly sensitive to the EMFs, and that's sort of what we see in these experimental studies where you see all these cardiac changes from EMF exposures. And there was one study that was done that I think is quite interesting. It hasn't been repeated, where it was shown that if you expose a rodent to EMFs, that you get heart failure-like changes in the sinoatrial node of the heart of these animals. So these animals are showing that part of the heart is exquisitely sensitive in terms of its structure to the EMFs. and you get heart failure-like changes from the EMF exposures. There was the 5G testing in Rotterdam, which I'm sure you've read about. The initial, when the initial claim was published, the industry denied testing 5G. But later, there was a later news report in which the reporter interviewed workers, and the workers said that they had been told to lie about it, that they had been testing 5G, and that the days of the testing corresponded with these birds dying of apparent sudden cardiac death. So the birds were flying along and then they crashed to the ground dead. There is a... Well, the industry claims these things all the time. But there is a news article out on that. I don't have it with me, but I've got it at home. I can probably email it to you if you want. So as I say, they were, according to the news article, the workers had been told to lie, and several of them did not lie, and they said that that's what was being done. And so, let me just say, I mean, based on these other things that I've said, I mean, it's certainly very plausible that that could be the case. And, and so anyway, that's the information that is out there. Now, the reason I got concerned about this myself, and I didn't used to have these as one of my 6 worst nightmares, has to do with what's happened at the Santa Anita racetrack in Southern California over the last 10 months. 34 horses have died on the racetrack. They're running around the racetrack and they crashed down dead. Most of those, not all of them, died of apparent sudden cardiac death. Okay, so why would we think that this has anything to do with the EMF exposures? The reason I think it has something to do with 36 with EMF exposure is there are 36 antennae on the Santa Anita racetrack and the adjacent Santa Anita Park where the racehorses are stabled when they're not running. 36 different antennae of different sorts. So at least one of them is 5G, a number of them are 4G, a number of them are other kinds of antennae that we're not used to thinking about. And then there are a whole bunch of others I don't have the foggiest idea what they are. So you can look these up in on the antenna search site in the US and see where the antennae are. And there are 36 antennae. So we have a huge densification of these antennae. Now, part of the reason I'm concerned about this is because the whole 4G, 5G system involves stunning antenna densification. And this has been one of the major concerns about it. So we may well be exposed to levels, comparable or maybe even larger, and pulsations comparable and even larger to what these racehorses are seeing. That's causing massive problems in these very large and very expensive animals. Okay, I want to say one other thing about this. Some of these animals died of massive bone breakage. So you say, well, what does massive bone breakage have to do with EMFs? You know, what happens when we have these EMF exposures, of course, is you activate the voltage-gated calcium channels. You get lots of calcium flowing into the cells of the body, and you can actually get a big drop in the extracellular calcium when that happens. What does your body do when it has a drop in extracellular calcium? Well, what it does is it secretes parathyroid hormone. Not thyroid, but parathyroid. Parathyroid hormone goes to the bones, pulls the calcium out of the bones to restore the extracellular calcium levels. Now, if you do that very often, you're going to very dramatically weaken the bones. Racehorses, of course, put great stress on their bones. So it makes great sense that, you know, you're going to have the bone breakage as well. And one of the things I think is important here is the following. Since we now know how these EMFs work, you know, when you look at these things, you can make sense out of everything. Everything makes sense. And that's, you know, is terribly, terribly important. Because biology is so complex, sometimes it's just bizarre beyond belief, and you really can't make sense out of anything. Let me say one other thing here. We have defects. This corresponds with the 5G rollout in areas in Germany and France. We're seeing some birth defects that are unusual, having to do with limb development. And where fingers are missing or highly deformed, where hands are missing or highly deformed, where whole limbs are missing and highly deformed. So, you know, babies born without an arm, perhaps even without two arms. You know, so we're seeing really, you know, very unusual kinds of things. Okay, so why should this have anything to do? And let me say, as far as I can tell, nobody who's talking about it is talking about it in the context of an EMF effect. The reason I think this is probably an EMF effect comes out of this review that I've got listed here. What that review shows is that elevation of both the VGCCs, the voltage-gated calcium channels, and also the voltage-gated sodium channels, and I haven't told you this, but they're also activated by the EMFs, that both of them can produce aberrations in limb development in mammals, okay, including humans. And so, you know, so I think it's very reasonable, given what we know about limb development and VGCCs, that this in fact is an EMF effect. Of course, that doesn't prove that it is, but what I think it argues is we need to start considering these things. And, you know, the standard practice is you don't even think about these things. So, okay, so let's go. Okay. Okay, what do we know about human effects? Other potential human effects. In Switzerland and Stuttgart, Germany, we have protests going on with regard to 5G. And in Switzerland, the effects that have been reported are these widespread neurological neuropsychiatric effects and also the cardiac effects. Those seem to be, you know, the things that are most obvious to people who are exposed to 5G. The Stuttgart protests, interestingly, have been protests from physicians there. This is in terms of what the physicians are seeing in their patients following 5G rollout in Stuttgart. And this is unusual because physicians usually don't get out en masse and protest things. This is an unusual thing. And they're seeing also these neurological neuropsychiatric effects and cardiac effects. And they're also seeing large increases in electromagnetic hypersensitivity, which is often abbreviated EHS, which is what? AHS? Is that right? AHS, okay. Okay. I guess Ha is German, is that it? And Ha is, no? Okay. Yeah, okay. Anyway, so anyway, there, I've got some URLs for some of the news articles on these things. I've been getting information, and I mentioned this before, from a psychiatrist in Southern California in areas where 5G has been rolled out. She is seeing very large numbers of people with suicidal and homicidal driving, you know, desire, let's say, and which are, you know, these are things of the sort she's never ever seen before in her practice as a psychiatrist. These are new things, and so you know, this is something. And those things, you know, so those are. Now, with regard to the you know, the neurological neuropsychiatric effects and cardiac effects and EHS, we see all three of those. You know, they were all reported in the two studies on smart meter radiation in humans. They also were reported in the occupational exposure studies that I referred to back in the 1970s and 1980s. The same three things as being clear things that are going on there. And so I don't think it's surprising that 5G may be able to produce still more severe effects of those sorts, which is what we're apparently seeing here. Now, so in terms of causation, that's not too surprising. You probably know that there have been these reported panic attacks, and this one just reports 2 of them, but I've been told that there have been others that have occurred since then, both in the Netherlands and in France, where a whole bunch of cattle became panicked and go running off. And so then the question is, and again, I don't know that anybody's connecting this with the VGCC mechanism, but I think it can be connected actually very easily. One thing that happens with EMFs through VGCC, there are 2 things that happen with EMFs through VGCCs that can help explain this. One is that you get fear responses in humans and in animals from these. And the other is that you get release of norepinephrine, the fight or flight hormone, in response. In fact, one of the problems with the EMS, I think, in terms of sleep, one of them has to do with melatonin, but I think one of the problems with regard to sleep has to do with excessive norepinephrine at night. Both of those things can happen. And so, again, I mean, this doesn't prove that these are 5G effects, but it makes it certainly very plausible that they may be, and that those things need to be considered. I think I'm going to skip through this. Are there safer alternatives? You bet. Wired systems are always better. Wired systems have very little impact on human health or environmental health, for that matter. They're faster, they're more reliable, they're more secure than any wireless system. It makes absolutely no sense to do this stuff wirelessly. And in fact, it's really, I mean, wired systems are less convenient and all that, but losing your brain function is convenient. And it's really stunning. So I think we need to push for wired systems. There is no excuse for doing this stuff. We need to get rid of all Wi-Fi. There's no reason to have Wi-Fi for anything. Do everything wired, it's much better. There are many, many things that we need to do, and so I hope we can get around. So let's, I don't know, do I have time for questions still? Is it, or have I gone through it all?
I think that we zijn toe aan een pauze. We pauzeren 10 minuten. Vragen kunnen straks naar de volgende presentatie gesteld worden. Dan is er ook een mogelijkheid tot een vorm van paneldiscussie. Dus ik stel voor dat nieuwe vragen even opzouten en even pauzeren. Al bedankt.